Hello and welcome to the 6th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will examine how to play against opens or jumps when we are the shorter covered stack. In order to accomplish that, we will look at spots we've already seen when we focused on the opening ranges of the bigger covering stacks in chapter 3. So a lot of spots will be from that, where we will instead be focusing on the responses from the covered stacks, and also some newer spots. Everything will still take place in this scenario that we've looked at in the previous chapters, where it's the 5:30 PKO tournament at the very beginning, and everyone has a starting stack. The starter's bounty, I misspoke. The starting stack is 25,000 chips, and the big line is 500. Just to give you a better view, so big line 500 and 25k is the starting stack. And everyone has a starting bounty. Okay, so we have under the gun the very big stack opening, and what we want to look at is how are all of the covered stacks behind supposed to play. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to first have a look at how they're supposed to play in a normal non-PKO tournament and try to make some comparisons and with some key conclusions from that. So now we're looking at the non-PKO tournament, the vanilla tournament. Under the gun opens, and if we look at the first player to act behind, EP, who has 26.6 big blinds, is supposed to play somewhat like this. So no jumps, 3-betting 4.5%, so a fairly tight 3-betting range, basically 10s plus, ace-king for value, and for bluff using some like ace-jack, king-10 suited, king-jack suited, ace-queen off kind of hands. Now, in the PSKO example, 26 big blinds is just not that much when the bounty is worth 13, as we've said already. So now EP's response looks a lot more like this. And we can see some key differences. So first, we don't have non-all-in 3-bets anymore. We only have jams or calls. The reason we move away from non-all-in 3-bets is that we basically don't really have much fold equity. We invite a lot of players, both the opener and players behind, to call and try to hit a good flop and stack us off. Because our bounty is so important compared to our stack, a non-all-in 3-bet just doesn't really accomplish much. So we won't have a jamming range, and this will be mainly ace-king offsuit, and then some of the middling pocket pairs like 10s, 9s, jacks, and some queens. The rest of our hands we pretty much want to be calling. Overall, in terms of which hands we call, it is very similar to the non-PKO example. We can see that we aren't really adding many different hands, maybe like pocket fives, but we're just calling instead of mixing in 3-bets with all of those hands. The reason we get to call a bit of a wider range is that we also call a lot of our very strong hands here, like ace-king suited, kings, aces. Therefore, our calling range is very well protected, so we can afford to add some weaker hands in there, like these pocket fives or 10-9 suited, and so on. So already a very key difference in how we approach this spot when we are early positioned with this middling stack and we are covered by the opener. Next up, let's look at how MP is supposed to act. So if under the gun opens and then EP folds with 26 big blinds, and we are back to MP, who has 47.5. In the non-PKO example, MP is supposed to play like this. So 3-betting about 6% and calling about 7.6% of the hands. We can see a lot of 3-bets with suited broadways, ace-queen off, ace-king off, and then of course queens plus, ace-king suited, and basically mixing a lot of middle strength hands here. We can see 10s, jacks mixing 3-bets, even some 9s. This is how it's supposed to look in a non-PKO tournament. Now, in the PKO, we again have a way different construction of the range. Overall, we can see that the 3-bet frequency has dropped significantly. So we go from 3-betting 6% to 3-betting 4.6%, so like 25% less. And also, the construction of the 3-bet range has changed quite a bit. We don't see that much of a mixed range, and it's a bit more polar here. So for example, these 3-bets with like 9s, 10s, jacks are no longer really here. And we also don't 3-bet hands like king jack suited, king queen suited. We just prefer to call those and go for a bit of a more polar 3-bet range, where we 3-bet some suited aces, some like king 10, king 9 suited. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Then also, the main big difference though is that we just end up calling a lot more. We go from calling 7.6 to calling 13.1. So we're talking about, what is it, like 90% more calls than before. And the reason for that is, on one hand, we again have a bit of a stronger calling range. because we don't really 3-bet these queens, jacks, 10s, 9s that much anymore, or we also don't 3-bet as much of the other strong hands. We just have a bit more of a strong hands in our calling range. This is one part of the reason why, and the second part of the reason is that we need to keep in mind that when the under the gun is the covering stack in a PSKO, his opening range will just be a lot wider. If you remember, in the non-PKO example, under the gun was opening 17.7, and in the PKO example where he covers everyone, he opens 24.7. So we are up against a way, way, way wider range. Therefore, we can call way more hands. A lot of these hands wouldn't be profitable flats in a non-PKO scenario where we're up against just a tighter range. The hijack has 44 big blinds. We'll play quite similarly. We can see that the two ranges are almost identical, which makes sense. The positions are close and the stacks are close, so not many things changing. The cutoff is the second biggest stack of the table. In the normal non-PKO example, suppose players something like this, so calling about 13% and 3-betting 6.6, whereas now in the PKO, again, the 3-bet has dropped a bit and the calling frequency has gone up significantly. The reason is the same. We call a few more strong hands, and more importantly, though, the out of the guns range is just way weaker and way wider here. So the cutoff gets to defend a lot more. On top of that, the cutoff also has a bit of a higher equity realization in this spot, because since it's a PKO, the stacks behind will not be squeezing as much because their fold equity is reduced. So to visualize this a bit better, if we have the under the gun opening and the cutoff calling, then in a normal tournament, the stacks behind would be very likely to squeeze a lot. In the PSKO, not so much, because their fold equity, as I said, is just drastically reduced. Therefore, the cutoff gets to see a flop by calling more often, therefore his equity realization goes up. Therefore, he gets to call a wider range. As for the button, in a normal tournament, non-PKO, the button is supposed to play like this, so calling about 15%, raising like 2.6 and jamming 3.8. And in the PKO, we have a pretty interesting change here. So the button doesn't have any no all-in 3-bets at this stack size, so it likes to go for a jam or call strategy. And the button also just calls less. We see that the call goes from 15% down to 12.4. The reason for this is that because the button is very short, now he's very vulnerable to squeezes after he ends up calling. Also, we don't really want to call almost any strong hands in the PKO example because we just get called way too often. In the non-PKO tournament, we can see aces are always calling, ace-queen suited always calling, a bunch of these hands. Whereas in the PSKO example, we are just jamming very linearly the top like 9% of our range. You can see we're not calling like ace-queen suited, we're not calling like ace-jack off. This hand that we're trapping in a normal tournament, we're not really trapping anymore here. So both because we're vulnerable to squeezes and also because we don't call strong hands, our call frequency on the button goes down, even though we're up against a much wider range. Understanding those nuances of PSKOs will be very significant for us being able to adjust properly in game. Finally, as for the blinds, in the non-PKO example, the small blind is supposed to call 18.5% and 3-bet around 7%, whereas in the PSKO, the small blind, again, 3-bet is about the same, but the call frequency increases by quite a bit. The reasoning is very similar. We're up against a much wider range, and the big blind is less likely to squeeze because he's covered by both players. Finally, for the big blind, in the normal tournament, calling 71.8 and 3-betting 6%, whereas in the PSKO, we can again see that the 3-bet has, well, it actually has gone down a little bit here. Sorry, I misspoke. It has gone up a little bit, and the calling frequency has gone up a bit as well. Now, the reason for that is that in the normal tournament, the big blind can't really 3-bet very wide for value because under the guns range is just very, very strong. Now, in the PSKO example, the under the guns range is much wider, as we've already said. So the big blind can just 3-bet wider for value. We can see these like 10s, 9s hands, for example. They never 3-bet in the normal tournament, but they always 3-bet along like ace-queen and so on in the PSKO. We can again see that there are basically no real bluffs from the big blind. It's just mostly a linear value range. Whereas in the normal tournament, we have a bunch of bluffs with like these suited connectors, like ace-10 off, king-5 suited. Now these hands are just no longer there. Only like super low frequencies. But overall, just much more linear. One thing also worth having a look at is the reaction against overcalls. So, for example, let's stick to under the gun opening. Then we have let's say, the hijack calling with 44 big blinds, so hijack calls, how does the cutoff get to play? The cutoff is covered by the original raiser, but covers the hijack. So in that case, the cutoff continues a very call-heavy range. Again, this will be a much wider calling range than in a non-PSKO tournament. The reason being that under the guns range way wider and we cover the caller, and just to be betting fairly linear for value again. So we can see that squeezing generally goes down quite a bit as well. One final thing to look at is what happens against 3-bets. So we have the under the gun player opening again. And this time, let's say that the hijack went for the 3-bet. How does the cutoff play then? Where, again, we're covered by the opener, but we cover the 3-better. And we see a very, very wide calling range here. The cutoff isn't supposed to play any jams. He's supposed to have some 4-bets, mainly kings and ace-king. We can see these are like the go-to 4-bet hands. And everything else ends up cold calling. So we once again see this difference between a normal tournament and a PSKO, where in the PSKO, we just want to be calling 3-bets quite a bit when we cover. So we get to call in position with, of course, aces to trap, some queens, jacks, tens, but then also a bunch of these ace-queen suited, king-jack suited, ace-jack suited, lower pocket pairs. Again, this doesn't really happen in the PSKO example, where after hijack 3-bet, the cutoff just doesn't really call much. It's some very low frequency and mostly ace-queen suited is the hand that wants to call. You can see, yeah, quite a bit difference. And the same can be applied to a lot of these scenarios. Now, if NP 3-bets instead of the hijack has 47 big blinds, then the hijack who doesn't cover, we can see doesn't play any calls pretty much. So we need to be covering the 3-better in order to call the 3-bet. Or cover the opener, cover one of the two at least. Okay. So with that, we can move on to our next scenario, which will be the other example we looked at in chapter 3. So cutoff being the big stack and opening. So just to visualize it again, we have the cutoff of 57 big blinds, opening into a 21 big blind stack, a 50 big blind stack, and then a 47 big blind stack. So the cutoff covers everyone. We have the cutoff opening. And first, the button doesn't really want to have not only 3-bets, just plays jam or call similar to before. Jam's a very wide linear range. The reason we get to jam this wide, which is wider than a normal non-PSKO tournament, is that the cutoff is just opening way more now. As a point of comparison, if this was the vanilla non-PSKO tournament, then the cutoff would be opening way less and the button's range would look like this. So we can see it's a very different jamming range. In the non-PSKO tournament, we jam less and we also jam these suited middling hands like Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, Jack 9 suited, and so on. The reason we jam those in the non-PSKO is that we get folds from other high cards. We get folds from like King Jack offsuit and stuff like that. Whereas now, in the PSKO example, we don't really get folds from those. So we don't jam these Jack 10 suited kind of hands. It's actually a losing jam now. It loses money. It's not that it's not preferable. It's losing money because we just don't fold out enough better hands. So we can see we instead jam a very, very linear absolute value kind of range where we'd rather jam ace 8 off than queen jack suited. The small blind who has 50 big blinds plays like this. So this looks fairly similar to a non-PSKO range. But again, the calling range is expanded a lot because the big blind is less likely to squeeze. And as we said, the opening range is going to be way wider. So if we compare this to the normal range and the non-PSKO range, it looks like this. So we can see the 3-bet drops down by like 1%, but the call frequency is increased by like 10% more. We go from calling 19% to calling like 29%. A lot of these offsuit ace-x, like offsuit 9x, you can see like 10-9 off, king 9 off. A lot of the suited stuff are now just profitable calls because of how wide cutoff's range is and because the big blind just doesn't get to squeeze as much as normally. Finally, as for how the big blind gets to play, it looks like this. So again, similar to a normal range, just gets to defend a bit more. And we again see this like suited middling hand 3-betting. The reason that we see those like 9-8 suited, 10-9 suited 3-bets from small and big blind, even though they're used in a normal tournament, maybe you would expect not to see them in the PSKO. However, the cutoff range is wide enough where we don't get jammed on as much. For example, after the small blind 3-bets, if we look at the cutoff's response, it's supposed to look like this. So we can see a lot of calling and very little jamming. So that's why a hand like 10-9 suited benefits a lot from 3-betting. It folds out hands immediately dominated by, like King 9 off, Queen 9 off, Jack 9 off, and gets called by a fairly wide range that it does well against. So it's important to identify how wide is the opening range we're facing and how likely are we to get jammed on. The less likely we are to get jammed on, the more we play a strategy that looks similar to a non-PKO spot with 3-betting like these middling suited kind of hands. In the event where we face many jams, we just don't really want to have those in our 3-bet range. Okay, so let's take this spot that we are now, where we have the big stack on the cutoff opening, and let's adjust the button's range a bit. So now the button has 21 big blinds. Let's change it a little bit so that the button has a shorter stack size. Let's assume that he has 15 big blinds. What changes then? Well, first thing is that the cutoff's opening range goes up. We go from opening 47% to now opening 50.6%. And again, the reason is that we have a much easier raise call against the button. The shorter his stack size, the more we want to raise so that we can get it in against him. Remember, he has 15 big blinds here, and his bounty is worth like 13. So we're just super incentivized to get it in with him. The button response looks like this, so very little calling, mainly jamming. But again, some of those Jack 10 suited kind of hands just way prefer to jam, because they don't to call instead of jam, because they just don't really fold out better hands. Just a quick look, after the button jams his 15 big blinds, there is no real calling from the stacks behind, because they're just in a very unfortunate position, because the cutoff can just jam everything, and they can't really call fold because we're sort of committed when the button's bound is so large. So we just continue by rejamming a fairly linear kind of range. You can see the small blind is rejamming suited Broadways, King Jack off, Ace 8 off, every pocket pair, suited aces. So the big blinds range also looks similar, so just very wide get it in ranges from both positions, even though they're covered by the cutoff. The reason this happens is that the cutoff range is just way too wide here. We don't really care about the button, like no matter what he has, we're happy to get it in with him. So because the cutoff range is so wide, we can see that both positions get it in very wide in this spot. As for what the cutoff overcalls, if let's say the big blind rejams for 47, so cutoff opens, button jams 15, and the big blind rejams 47, then the cutoff ends up overcalling a range that looks like this. So every pocket pair, Broadway, suited aces, Ace 8 off, even suited 9x. So it's just a spot where every position really wants to gamble when the button gets it in. There's so much dead money in the pot that ranges are just ridiculously wide. And this is another very good takeaway, that in scenarios like this, we just shouldn't be afraid to gamble. The way the tournament is designed, the PSKO, you just get to go in very, very often with a very wide range and hope you win. It's just way more of a gambly format than a normal non-PSKO tournament. Then let's look at this similar scenario. So again, cutoff opens and the blinds have this stack. But instead of the button having 15 big blinds, let's say he has 10 big blinds. So what changes then? Again, the cutoff range goes up even more. Before, when the button had 15, the cutoff was opening 50.6%. Now that the button has 10, the cutoff is opening 57%. So we can see, again, an even higher increase. The button gets to play like this. So even at 10 big blinds, we do see some flat calls. These hands are just performing way better than calls, because we get to go post-flop with a big blind and the wide cutoff range fairly often, and we get to dominate them, and we flop pretty good. We aren't really calling and then folding. If we call and then there's a squeeze situation, we usually just get it in. Maybe if they go three-way all in, we can fold some like 10-9 suited, but even that's unlikely. Let's see. So button jumps, and then let's say small blind rejumps, and the cutoff, the button calls, and then small blind jumps. By the way, the small blind after the cutoff calls is supposed to jam a really, really, really wide range. The small blind after the cutoff opens and the button calls. Yeah, I maybe misspoke. So the reason it worked like this is that even though the small blind is covered by the opener, by the cutoff range is so wide that the small blind can jam ridiculously wide and try to get it in against the button. Well, as we've said, once we call with 10 big blinds, we're just not really looking to fold. So suited aces, like pocket pairs, offsuit Broadways, any ace-x are profitable jams in this spot. After the small blind jams, and let's say the cutoff folds, then button, as I said, isn't really folding anything. If the cutoff calls, who is also, by the way, just supposed to call very, very wide, then No, the button is just not really folding anything, even if we go 3-way all-in. So the reason that from the button we get to call these hands with the 10 big blind stack is all the EV we gain when we go post-flop against the very weak cutoff and, say, big blinds range. So as we said, after the button calls, then the small blind gets to overcall really, really wide and jam really, really wide. And the same goes for the big blind. We can see the big blind is calling almost any two and is jamming 26% of hands. This is a very important spot to understand, that once we have these short stacks calling, then we can take advantage of how wide the opener's range is, and we just get to jam super, super wide ranges, just very, very aggressively. If the button jams now, then we again don't really have calling from the positions behind because they're sort of committed. So we just have wide rejam ranges. You can see the small blind rejam something like this, and the big blind rejam something like this. If you're ever, by the way, forgetting the stack size or the boundaries, you can always check them out bottom left here. You can see all the stack sizes and all the boundaries, and even the action. You can see the button is all in now. Okay, so one final scenario that I want to look at is what if we have the big stack on the button, where the button has 70 big blinds, and we have different stack sizes on the blinds. So one scenario would be, what if we have, as I said, 70 big blinds on the button, small blind has 15, and the big blind has 40. How do the short stacks play then? So the button, who is the big stack with 70 big blinds, gets to RFI super wide, 61.5% of the time. And the small blind doesn't get to call much, calls very little hands, and just jams a very linear, very aggressive range. We can see the small blind here is jamming wider than a normal tournament. And the reason is that the button is just opening wider as well. But then also, a lot of these hands are just value jams, because we jam like king 10 offsuit, and the button is calling like king 4 off. We just have zero fold equity against the button. So we just take all of these hands which are profitable or ahead of the button's range, and we just get to jam them. Of course, it's not exactly like that because we have the big blind in play too, but sort of works that way. That's why we can see these king 9 off jams that we don't usually see for 15 big blinds. So small blind not really calling, jamming super wide, and just a very value-oriented range. The big blind, who has 40 big blinds, gets to play like this. So we do see some jams, mainly these middling to low pocket pairs and some ace-jack off, ace-queen off. And in terms of 3-bets, we see a fairly linear and very polar 3-bet range. So we have jacks, queens, kings, aces, we have these good suited hands, and then we have some like ace-5 off, ace-6 off, ace-8 off, and so on. After 3-betting, the button gets to play like this, so mostly call, a little bit of jamming, and the 3-bet call range from the big line is fairly natural, so like ace-10 plus, and the pocket pairs. Now, I also run this scenario with a few different stack sizes. So now I said that the small blind had 15 and the big blind had 40. I also run this in vanilla so that we can compare. I guess we should also have a look at that. So in the vanilla tournament, same stack sizes, but no bounties. Then the button is opening 42% instead of 61. So we can see huge difference. The small blind is jamming like this. So we can see no like king 9 off, calls a bit more and jumps a bit of a tighter range. And the big blind is playing like this. So the big blind is jamming less and 3-bets a bit more. So the main difference is how wide the button is opening. And of course that the small blind is jamming a bit more. Now, as said, I also run this with a few different stack sizes. The next one is button still has 70 big blinds, so covers both. The small blind has 25 and the big blind has 60. So 70, 25, 60. And what I wanted to look at here is first, how does the small blind play? And then second, how does the big blind play when the stacks are so close? Yes, the button still covers. That's the topic of the chapter we're looking at. But the stacks are way closer. So button opens 55.2%. So opens tighter than when it was 15 and 40. Now that's 25 and 60. The button has tightened up. Again, the reason is that we can get played back at more now, and we can really raise call our entire range against the small blind. Small blind range looks like this. So again, a bunch of jamming, very linear looking range, jamming just our best hands, but then also a lot of calling. A lot of these hands don't get to call in a normal non-PKO tournament, but they do end up calling here because on one hand, the button's range is way wider, and on the second hand, we are a little bit protected from squeezes because the button covers the big blind. Again, we see these low pocket pairs don't really jam. They would always jam in a normal non-PKO tournament, but now not enough fold equity. After the small blind calls, the big blind gets to play like this. So, of course, a bunch of squeezing, but not anything ridiculously extreme. Now, if the small blind folds, the big blind gets to play like this. So this is fairly close to a normal range in a non-PSKO tournament. The defending range looks very similar, and the 3-bets look very close to that indeed. We see a lot of these suited hands. And the reason is that now that we're at 60 big blinds, the bounty, while still in effect, of course, it's not as significant, so it doesn't influence the strategies as much. So against the 3-bet, from the big blind, the button gets to continue like this, which again looks reasonably close to that of a non-PSKO tournament. We always need to keep in mind that the strategies change as long as the bounty is very relevant. The less relevant the bounty becomes, the bigger portion of a stack, the less important it is, the less the strategies are also affected. The closer we go to the bounties being insignificant, the closer the strategies approach a normal non-PSKO tournament. And that is why I've said since the start that there's not like a specific set of ranges that I can provide. What we do is just look at different scenarios and we try to simulate what we see here to the in-game scenarios that we face when we play. And to better illustrate that, I also run this bot with the same stack sizes, so bottom 70, small blind 25, big blind 60. But instead of the big blind having one starting bounty, I gave him two starting bounties. So as if he had knocked out two people. So a few things that we can already immediately notice is that the button's RFI range again goes up. We go from 55 when the big blind has starting bounty to over 60% when the big blind has two starting bounties. The big blind range, the small blind range, very similar. The big blind range, though, we can see has changed quite a bit. So the big blind was 3-betting 13% before and 3-betting all of those suited connected hands. Whereas now, when the big blind has two starting bounties, we can see that the 3-bet frequency has dropped down to 11%. So 13, 11. We can see a lot of these hands that were 3-betting before are now no longer 3-betting. So I hope this paints the picture a bit better about what I said, that the strategies change as long as the bounties are relevant. So if we give him 3 starting bounties, then a lot of these 3-bets will start disappearing as well, and we'll play, again, a fairly polar 3-bet strategy, because we would be getting jammed on even more. And with that, I think we can wrap this chapter up. We saw a lot of examples of how to play against opens when we are the covered stack. So I think we can move on to the next chapter, which is blind versus blind play.